Good afternoon. As chairman of the Associated Student Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome you to our 7th program of the winter quarter. Our speaker today is a man who has spent his entire life in the pursuit of human interests. In 1963, Dr. Salk developed a vaccine for polionitis.
63, 55.
55. I told you. He has since served on almost every medical commission since 1964, or 55. His credentials are so numerous that it would probably take the entire hour just to list them. Would you please give a warm welcome to a great humanitarian, Mr. Dr. Salk.
I appreciate your intentions. And I think this brings to mind the interest that I suppose I have in trying to seek the truth, to see and speak about things as they really are. And perhaps this might be a good occasion for us just to chat informally about things that could conceivably be of mutual interest, so as to give you some background perspective that might put us into communication. I would say that in answer to some of the questions that have already been asked of me, that I did the usual thing of going to school in New York City. I went to City College and to medical school there, interned there, and then left to spend 5 years at the University of Michigan, where I was during the war, and the work I did then was on influenza. It led to the vaccine that is now generally in use, and subsequently I went to the University of Pittsburgh for about 15 years, where I continued to work on flu and then began work on polio. And since 1962, the end of 62, I've been in San Diego, La Jolla, where we have created, established, and are now hoping to develop further an Institute for Biological Studies that has much broader implications than that name implies. I was asked earlier whether I ever practiced medicine, and I said no. I've been engaged in research ever since the beginning, and my further response to a further question was that when I entered medical school, it was with the idea of becoming involved in research. I was also pointed out that most of the friends of my questioner who are in medical school intend to practice medicine, and I said that was quite normal. Just about 1 or 2% of those who enter into that profession via that route spend their lives engaged in what we think of as research. And when asked if that wasn't frustrating, I said no. I thought that if I were to be a medical practitioner, that would be frustrating, meaning that each of us does what it is in him to do. Now, I'm not here to preach in any way or to deliver any kind of message, but rather I'd like very much to have an opportunity to speak to you about things that might be of interest to you. I say this because the world is going through very interesting changes now, and changes of such nature that I believe that this is perhaps the most interesting time that man has ever lived, and perhaps is more interesting than will ever be true again in the future. I say this because I've thought about the questions and the problems that confront us, but I think about them from the point of view of a physician and of a biologist. And I have been attempting to write about the things that I have been thinking about, problems that are of current interest, the crises of our times, you might say, from the biological point of view. I believe that what we need now is man needs a new view of himself. He needs to see himself as he really is, and I believe that he needs to see himself from the point of view of himself as a living organism with the kind of understanding that can be brought to bear from what I think of as the epistemologic contributions that are being developed by biologists. It was about 20 years ago that the nature of genetic material was understood, that hereditary information was contained in a tape-like molecule that, when decoded, expressed the nature of the organism that was coded in that molecule. And since then, an enormous amount of knowledge has developed about the nature of the control and regulatory mechanisms in living systems, the molecular level, the level of the cell, the organism, and society. And because of insights of this kind, I believe that in the period ahead, it is going to be necessary for our education to include knowledge of this kind, which is just beginning to be developed in a way that is both comprehensible to the average person and can conceivably so alter his point of view, his attitude about himself and about others, as to make an enormous difference in the period ahead in man's relationship to man and man's relationship to himself. I think the time is approaching when most of the physical ills will be dealt with, those that can be dealt with easily, those that involve agents or causes that arise from outside. You might think of those as the exogenous causes, those due to infectious agents, those due to problems of malnutrition. And the problems that will remain are those that arise from within, whether these are errors of a genetic nature, hereditary diseases that will tend to accumulate as we prevent death by the various devices that biological and medical sciences are providing, all of which lead to increases in numbers of people, change in the character and the quality of the individuals who survive, and hence a change in the character and quality of those who will remain to survive in the future. And what we will be confronted with in due course as the most important problem of all, which is the problem with which we are confronted with now as well, is what I think of as the problem of man's relationship to man and man's relationship to himself. And I dare say that you probably think more about these questions, the latter, than you do about any others, and I shall be glad to discuss any or all of the things that I've touched on, or anything that may be on your mind from my point of view, if any of you are willing to begin and to try to draw me out in any way that you might care to do. Perhaps in that way I'll be able to expand more on things that would be of interest to you rather than those things that I might think about, might like to talk about. Yes? I think that there are some microphones around. I almost said microscopes, microphones around. Please. By that I mean that he will have to understand more about his makeup, his origins, and his relationship to nature. You see, many of the concepts of man have been based upon supernatural concepts. And if and what I meant specifically is that man is a product of evolution, and he's very much in the process of evolution. And in that sense, I meant that he would have to understand himself as he really is. Now, would have to elaborate this in much more detail, but I guess I'm saying that man evolved and wasn't created as a special entity. And it is the point of view of the natural philosopher or the naturalist that I think would be most useful to man in understanding the paradoxes of his life, and therefore perhaps resolving these paradoxes in a way that could make life somewhat more livable.
Dr. Salk, because you are a medical doctor, you have touched upon more than medical terminology.
Mm-hmm.
You have sort of whetted our appetites with the idea of the sociological, philosophical,
mm-hmm.
psychological, etc. Now that is very, very meaningful to me.
Yes.
And I would like you to elaborate, because we know your qualifications medically.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about the other issues I have spoken about?
Well, I think these are all of a piece. I have difficulty separating one from the other. And in fact, that was one of the motivations behind establishing the institute that we have in La Jolla. And in fact, there are in an institute called an Institute for Biological Studies not only experimental biologists, but people from philosophy, sociology. We are attempting to wed these by not having disciplines represented, but being concerned with questions. And the unifying theme behind the Institute, or at the Institute, is what I inferred a moment ago when I talked about the mechanisms of control and regulation, which we must understand at the molecular level, because it is my view that that pattern simply exists, but in higher and higher orders of complexity as one goes higher and higher in the scale of complexity, which is the result of evolution. So that as evolution has proceeded, I see evolution as simply an increase in complexity, but with the same fundamental patterns of relationship of balance. Because all living systems that survive, or that have survived, survive because of the potential or the dualistic nature of the system. And therefore I'll quickly say that life and death, one cannot exist without the other. Without death, life could not exist. Without life, needless to say, death could not exist. And the person who drove me here began to talk about being rather cynical and seeing the worst in man, and I had to point out that without the worst there could not be the best, and without the best there couldn't be the worst. There are deep philosophic implications, I think, in what is being learned by biologists. And I believe that in time we will be thinking and speaking of biophilosophy, of a philosophy arising out of an understanding of the nature of life, and not a philosophy arising out of someone's mind or someone's head as purely imaginary. I think we need a new imagery. And the new imagery that we need must come from nature, and it must come from living nature. Not the mechanistic views, but the views of the organicist, if you will, the views of those who have a deep appreciation of the nature of life itself. And it's that I think that I'd like to say in answer to your question. And once we have that kind of comprehension, then what appears to be paradoxical becomes comprehensible. And the existence of paradoxes, I believe, based upon a misapprehension, a misconception. It's because our expectations, because of disappointment of our expectations, and our expectations are based upon what isn't so. And it's for that reason that I started out by saying something about the truth. How things really are, not how we wish they were or imagine them to be. And this, I think we now know how to establish. And even though there's a great tendency to be anti-technology and anti-science, I believe that it's this kind of approach, the use of the scientific method, by humanists, by philosophers, that could be enormously valuable. I therefore see no distinction of a formalistic nature in the various things that we've been talking about. And I prefer, therefore, to use whatever discipline is necessary to answer whatever question exists. I prefer to think in terms of questions rather than in answers. I mean, an answer is an end, but a question leads to another question. And that is what we must pursue endlessly, because that's the nature of the evolutionary process itself.
I just heard you... Oh.
Yes, whoever it is who spoke, go on.
Oh, I'm right here.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I just heard you mention that it's necessary for life to exist, that death exists too.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering if you thought that medical science will ever make immortality possible, and if so, like how important is this kind of research to you, and how do you feel about that kind of thing?
Well, I can answer that very simply by saying no.
Yeah.
Because the first question you asked me was, do I think that medical science can make immortality possible? If I say no, then I don't have to answer the other questions.
Oh, okay.
And the reason I don't have to answer them is because they're really not meaningful questions, because they're based on a false premise. And so first we establish the premise being that immortality, however you mean that, is not something that I can comprehend. If you would imagine, for example, that the first living entity, if it continued to replicate without death, would have in a sense meant that there would be no evolution. And so by definition, death is a part of life and is part of evolution. That's what I mean by reality. That's what I mean by seeing things as they really are. So that I would urge that you hear what I say from the point of view of that which is testable, that which is verifiable, that which we can imagine, we must consider as an hypothesis. And we cannot build on hypotheses. We have to build on that which we can verify and that which we can project on that basis. Yes.
Why would evolution necessarily follow the statement you just made? You said
Follow?
in the event of death, you said that evolution would disappear.
If there was no, I don't want to get lost now in a maze, or get off just on with words, get lost with words. Evolution is in the nature of nature, and as part of the evolutionary process, and as part of nature, death is inherent.
Dr. Salk?
Do you, have I made myself clear?
You're making a statement trying to justify the point. I don't see the connection between, I don't see the inconsistency of death and evolution, frankly.
No, I said that death and evolution were part of nature, and that without that they are necessarily coexistent.
Well, I feel that they're not antagonistic to each other. That's the point I'm trying.
Would you make the statement positively?
Well, I mean, in the question to compare.
I was asked if I thought that there was such a thing as a man could be made immortal.
That's right.
And I say no. Do you believe that man can be immortal? We agree. Sorry. Yes.
Dr. Salk, I'd like to ask you a question directly related to your discovery of the polio vaccine. Was this done purely in a research techniques, using the research techniques? In other words, where you theorized a path and went straight down, or a number of paths, and where you ended up right at the ultimate solution, or like many of the discoveries where there are accidents involved, whereas you theorized something, you tried it, it didn't work that way, went the other way, but you came out of it anyway?
Well, it was a very logically constructed piece of work. It just had to be. It had to come out the way it did. With the unknown being the following. As you know, the vaccine consists of the poliovirus itself, which is grown and treated chemically so as to destroy the disease-producing part and retain the immunizing part. What we did not know before the work began was whether or not it would be possible to so treat the virus as to destroy the disease-producing part and retain the immunizing part. Since these two could be dissociated by treating it in such a way as to kill one part and retain the other, then everything followed logically from there. Then a whole series of discoveries were made, because many things were not known until tested. So that the discoveries, as one might think of them, of deeper insight into the nature of the virus or the viruses and the nature of the immunologic system came about as a result of the experimentation. But the basic hypothesis was that it should be possible to prevent a virus disease by means of a killed virus vaccine. Prior to that time, it was assumed that it would not be possible to protect effectively against a virus disease except with a living virus. And that was also the unknown question. There were many others, whether one could effectively control the disease and prevent spread by the use of preparations of this kind. And all these questions were answered in the affirmative. Also, was the immunity enduring? This too was revealed by the by the work itself. So that once you set out on a course with a question, and that's resolved, then you go to the next and in sequence, and that was the nature of the process. Yes?
Dr. Salk, I wonder if you could, back on the subject of the nature of man, I wonder if you could contrast your view of man with that of B.F. Skinner. What is the real nature of man, according to you?
Well, I would, rather than contrast it with someone else's view, I would prefer to draw attention to certain attributes of living things, and then by analogy compare that to man. As you know, there are two essential components to living systems. One is the genetic and the other is the somatic. That is to say that in the DNA, which is contains the genetic code, there is inscribed the information which, when decoded, expresses itself in the organism itself. Now, the DNA molecules, when they first arose in nature, themselves had to survive. And then, as a result of an evolutionary process, the full nature of which is not yet clear, a cell membrane was formed. And within that cell membrane, there contains a very complicated machinery, in a way, for making the genetic code, for making the DNA molecule, and at the same time, the decoding of that process gives rise to the cell itself. There you have what is sometimes thought of as the chicken and the egg problem. Here you have the plan, its expression, and the expression of the plan leads to the duplication of the plan. Now, I think there are counterparts to this when one then leaps to the human level, in the sense that man is both intuitive and intellectual. I think that there is that man is both subjective and objective, and man is both creative and inventive. And these two aspects of man need to be developed and educated and trained separately and together. This dualism, or this dualistic view of man, to me provides the realism on the basis of which to resolve many of the paradoxes if we tend to view man one way or the other. It's these two aspects together which make up man, and both have to be trained and both have to be developed separately and together. Now, yes.
Do they come from the DNA tape? You know, when you speak of the creativeness, inventiveness, etc.
Yes.
Now, you see, if you...
That's inherent.
If you were a scientist...
Yes.
You are, and you were a student of philosophy...
Yes.
And you began to speak about creativeness, etc.
Yes.
To a philosopher. And you say, well, now I feel that these are developed through the DNA tapes, etc., etc.
I believe that these traits are inscribed in that code, and I believe that the differences amongst men are attributable to the differences in the genetic code, and that these human attributes are as much inscribed in the code as our capacity to metabolize sugar. Let me give you an illustration of the influence, of an environmental influence that will bring out a genetic capacity, a genetically predetermined capacity. If you take a bacterium, let us say E. coli, which has the genetic capacity to produce an enzyme which will digest a certain sugar. That enzyme, which is made because the DNA contains the instruction for the formation of that enzyme, which will metabolize that sugar, that enzyme or that protein will not be manufactured unless the substrate is present in the medium. The genetic capability is there, but the somatic expression of it is not expressed unless the stimulus exists in the environment. Then there is another E. coli that does not have the capacity to metabolize this sugar. It does not have the code for the formation of this particular enzyme that would metabolize that sugar. And even if you put that sugar in the medium, that enzyme will not be formed. In this instance, I'm describing the way in which what you might think of as an environmental influence, the substrate upon which that enzyme will operate, is necessary to be present to catalyze or to release the formation of that particular protein. Now, if this is too complex, I hope that I've explained it so that you can visualize what's happened. And perhaps you then might be able to take that imagery and see how this applies to other aspects of human life. And what this says to me, in a way, is that there is an enormously greater capability within man for expression, for eduction, depending upon the circumstances in which man lives. And therefore, both his intuitive and his intellectual capabilities are far greater, very likely, than is expressed. And it is the need for understanding the nature of this process that I've just described, for example, and to see how those principles can also apply to what we think of as strictly human attributes, which I believe are also coded in the same way.
Dr. Salk,
yes.
I'd like to return to your work on the polio virus once again. I understand that with the initial immunizations that were given, there was included what seemed to be a harmless virus, an SV virus, and that in further preparations this was done away with, and that there were subsequent experiments done in which the SV virus was shown to have ill effects in monkeys. It's been about 20 years, and they say that there are no results as far as the human condition is concerned,
Yes.
but that's pretty short of a time. Are you very concerned about what long-range effect the SV virus, which was given with the polio virus, the Salk vaccine, may have?
I answer the question that you asked about being concerned. I would say no. There are a great many viruses, as you know, that exist in nature and within ourselves that are rather harmless, and most often they don't have any adverse effects. I might say, as a matter of interest, that when the vaccine field trials were first carried out, they were carried out with virus grown in a culture system in which the SV40 virus was not present. It was only on further developments of the tissue culture technology that improvements in tissue culture technology led to cultures in which the SV40 virus appeared. And the reason for that is technical, and we need not go into it. Subsequently, it was found that the SV40 virus was more resistant to formaldehyde inactivation than was the polio virus itself, and therefore batches did contain the SV40, S meaning simian, V meaning virus, and 40 is simply the label attached to a whole series of strains. What has been shown is that this virus in tissue culture has the capacity to transform cells from normal into cancer-like cells. But in an animal, this does not take place, excepting under very special conditions, that is, when injected into a newborn animal that has no immunologic defenses. And therefore, since one cannot produce the disease, any disease with this virus, where the immunologic system is intact, then there's no reason to believe that that virus will necessarily produce the same effects as they can in tissue culture or in the newborn animal injected on the day of birth. For these reasons, I think that it's unlikely that they will have any harmful effect. And furthermore, studies that have been done have failed to reveal any indication of any harmful influence.
Dr. Salk?
Yes?
I was wondering if there's a possibility that man could control himself, say, if man has these say a man has aggressive tendencies that are dictated by, say, a DNA or whatever, and are these aggressive tendencies able to be, say, controlled, maybe through your research or something, or do we have to resign ourselves, say, to being, what we are, and we can't really hope to change the nature of man in any really significant way?
I don't think that we're going to be able to change the nature of man in any significant way by manipulating the genetic code. Any idea of genetic engineering and things of that kind to change the nature of man, I cannot visualize how this could possibly be accomplished. I think nature has locked the code into place in such a way that we're not going to be able consciously and deliberately to manipulate it. All of the work that's done on so-called genetic engineering involve the manipulations that affect the DNA in the somatic cells, not in the germ cells, not in the sperm and the ovum. And that's a very important distinction that you should keep in mind, that one is accessible and the other is essentially inaccessible. I think that the greatest influence upon man will be the environmental conditions and the circumstances of man's life. There is, however, a change taking place in the germ plasm or the germ pool, the gene pool of man, in that many more individuals survive who might otherwise die, with an increase in the number of potential defects. One example is that of the diabetic. Many more diabetics remain alive to childbearing age and produce more diabetics because that's due to an hereditary factor. With genetic counseling now and the establishment by amniocentesis, which is the removal of cells from the amniotic fluid during pregnancy, one can determine whether genetic defects are manifest in the fetus, certain genetic defects. Under those circumstances, pregnancy can be terminated. If there is no evidence of a defect in the child, the pregnancy is allowed to go to term. That child can then develop into an adult, which will still carry the genetic defect on into the population for expression in subsequent progeny. In that sense, changes are taking place in the germ pool of the gene pool of man. But I don't see that we are going to be able ourselves to manipulate this by chemical means or by manipulation of the genes. Yes?
Dr. Salk, I'd like to find out how you feel about the current cancer research whether you feel that the approach they're taking is a correct one, or whether you feel there should be some other type of approach, how you feel about Baltimore or Tiemann's work with RNA in particular.
Well, I think that the field of cancer research now is sufficiently broad so that I can't comment on it negatively or adversely. Much more attention is now beginning to be drawn to the role of the immunologic system as an important component in clinical cancer. You see, when you draw attention to the work of Baltimore and Tiemann, whose interests have been in the transformation of normal cells into cancer cells under the influence of viruses, that's one part of the cancer problem. That work gives profound insight into the nature of the biochemical events that take place as a cell becomes transformed from a normal into a cancer cell. Now, other factors beside viruses are capable of producing such effects. Chemicals, for example, and very likely the chemical influences precipitated by or attributable to cigarette smoking, just as an instance. X-ray or radiation will also produce such effects, and then simple copying errors in the translation of the genetic code and in the production of RNA and proteins. And it's through the interference with these mechanisms that viruses operate, that chemicals operate, that X-rays have an effect. And there are some cancers that are due to the persistence of embryonic molecules that fail to switch from the embryonic to the adult form. But every cancer cell, virtually, is different on its surface from a normal cell, even though the differences are very subtle. And these differences are recognized by the immunologic system and recognize the difference between self and not self tissue. Now, most of us, I would say that cancer cells are constantly occurring in the body, but yet 85% of people don't die of cancer, or 15% do. The observations that have been made in patients in whom kidney transplants have been made and in whom immunosuppressive treatments have been applied in order to keep the transplant or the graft in place have a much higher incidence of cancer than do others. It now appears from that evidence, as well as other evidences in the laboratory, that the immunologic system does operate to keep the organism at least clinically free of cancer, in that there is an immune response that recognizes and disposes of cancer cells. Now, if the immune system fails to operate, then cancer becomes clinical. Now, one of the curious things about this, and you asked whether I think that the work that is being done in cancer is sound, is that this broad approach to the cancer problem, from the point of view of the molecular cellular biologists, has revealed that the immune system is made up of two basic components, so that the antibody response to a foreign substance can be either associated with the white blood cells, the lymphocytes, or be associated with a factor present in the serum antibody, a circulating antibody in the serum. In the case of graft rejection, the essential factor involved in the rejection of the graft is the so-called cell-associated immunity rather than the humoral or antibody in the serum. In the case of cancer, it is presumed that the cell-associated immunity is also the one that is effective in bringing about the rejection of the cancer cells. Now, it's likely that the so-called serum antibody is also active or effective, but that there is a defect in the cancer cell, so that when antibody attaches itself to the cancer cell, it is attached in such a way that a certain lytic substance that's also present, called complement, does not attach in a way to produce the lysis of the cell. And this antibody masks the cancer cell from being recognized by the cell-associated immune factor, which would otherwise attack it and destroy it. And therefore, we see the paradox that two different immune responses to the cancer cell, in one instance, has an anti-cancer effect, the other a kind of pro-cancer effect in that it protects the cancer cell from the what we might think of as the anti-cancer antibody associated with the cell-associated immunity. Now, it's the recognition of the existence of these two factors, one of which acts against the cancer cell and in favor of the patient, the other acts in favor of the cancer cell and against the best interest of the patient. The recognition of the operation of these two systems, which produce paradoxical effects that now lead to work aimed at enhancing one and suppressing the other. I attempted in this brief explanation to indicate that I believe that a great deal of logic is now beginning to appear in the approach to dealing with the cancer problem, not only in terms of our understanding the nature of the process, but the nature of the defense mechanisms on the part of the host. I think we probably are coming close to the end of the hour.
Dr. Salk,
Yes.
there is a new theory and even best-selling book on the vitamin C and cold. Dr. Salk, being a virologist, I want your straightforward opinion on this issue.
I'm afraid that I don't know too much about it. I did buy Dr. Pauling's book recently, and I have not yet read it, and so I couldn't really answer this on the basis of any views of my own. I would just have to discuss it too hypothetically to make it worthwhile.
Dr. Salk.
I think that, well, let's just make this the last question. If any of the others of you have anything that you'd like to ask me about, I'll remain here for a little while the others go off to class, so that ask this one last question.
I would like to know what are the prospects of developing an immunization for any of the venereal diseases.
Any what?
For any of the venereal diseases, especially syphilis, since it's the major
yes.
one.
Some of the problems there concern the extraction of an antigen or an immunizing substance from the spirochete of syphilis and being able to grow it in sufficient quantities and concentration. And I know that there are people working on this problem, but to the best of my knowledge, there is no clue now as to how such a practical immunizing agent could be developed.
Thank you very much.
The reason we have to leave is because we're having a program